Kesubos Daf Vase contains one Mishnah and three sugyas. The first is the sugya of what happens when a man has to redeem his wife, but she is usher to be married to him for other reasons. Does he still have an obligation to redeem her or not? How does this fit with the fact that the Kesuba says that he has to take her back as his wife? The next sugya will be that of the husband and his estate paying for the wife's medical expenses. Tomorrow we'll discuss if the husband is not around, if he died, which part of his inheritance go towards the medical expenses for his wife. Then we'll get to the Mishnah, which will introduce us to our third topic, and that is the concept of Kesubos Benin Zichrin, that the dowry that a father gives to his daughter and the Kesuba promises to his wife are inherited by the sons, the children of the wife, and the children of the daughter, and not other sons. And we'll explain where this halacha comes from and give us some details of it. So the first discussion, as we had said, let's begin. The first discussion is that of what happens when a man's wife was captured and he has an obligation in the Kesuba to redeem her. But the way the Kesuba defines it is that he has to redeem her and take her back as a wife. Now what happens if he can't take her as a wife because she's usher to be married to him? So the Gemara is immediately going to distinguish between whether he's a Kohen and the reason she's usher to marry him is because he's a Kohen but he can marry everybody else, or if he's a Yisrael and she's usher to marry all Yisrael, all Bnei Yisrael. Now our Mishnah had said that the Kesuba defines it as follows: if he's a Yisrael, then he has to take her back and marry her. If he is stay married to her. If he is a Kohen, then he has to take her back and return her to the city. And the reason is because a captive can never be returned to her husband if he's a Kohen, because we assume that she was nenas and is now usher to her husband. Now we're talking about a case where she was usher to her husband anyway. So if she's usher to all of Yisrael, like for example, she's a mamzeres or nesina, so there you definitely cannot apply the obligation to redeem her, because you cannot say he has to take her back as a wife. You can't even say he has to take her back to the city. There's nothing he can do. There isn't anybody who could marry her. There she's usher to marry to all Bnei Yisrael. Therefore, that obligation does not apply. The question is, what happens if she's something like a almana l'kohen gadol? So she's not allowed to marry him, but she could marry other people. So Abaye says, so you still have an obligation to redeem her, because the statement of the redemption of the Kohen's wife is you take her back to the city. It doesn't say that he has to marry her, so this fits perfectly. He doesn't have to marry her. And therefore, the obligation still exists. The fact that she's usher to be married to him is not a contradiction to the fact that he has to take her back and bring her to her home city. Now, Rava disagrees. Rava says that the obligation is really to take her back and to marry her. For a Kohen, we say that the fact that that she's captured is not going to take her away from her obligation to be redeemed. The issa that's created by the capture, that now she's usher to her husband because he's a Kohen, that's not going to mess up her right to redemption by her husband, her right for her husband to pay her way out. That's what we're telling her. Otherwise, she doesn't have any redemption from her husband because he's a Kohen. So that's the only situation. That it's only the fact that she was nenas now that the Kohen is obligated anyway. If she was usher to him anyway for other reasons, if she was an almana l'kohen, a gadol, she's usher to him anyway, then there's no redemption. Then we don't have a clause on that. We don't say, oh, well, I only have to, the Kohen's only halacha is to redeem him to redeem her to bring her back to the city and not as a wife. That's only all that meant to say was that he still has to redeem her even though she's nenas. Now we can't stay married to her. It did not say that in a case where even Yisrael wouldn't have to take her back because he can't marry her. It did not say that a Kohen would have to take her back. Therefore, in a case like that, Rava says there is no obligation to redeem her. All right, now the Gemara wants to say that this seems to be also a machlokes tanaim. So the Gemara brings a machlokes tanaim in a case of somebody who made a neder, he forswore any hanar from his wife. Obviously, a man and a woman who have an isser hanar between them, which can be created artificially only by a neder, can't be married to each other. So their marriage is going to end and it's going to dissolve. What happened here was that before they dissolved the marriage, she was captured. Now he has an obligation to redeem her, but now you have a situation where he's usher to take her back as a wife because they have an Isser Hana between them. So what's the halacha here? So the Gemara says, well, he certainly owes her ksuba. And you have a machlokes whether he has an actual chiyuv to redeem her or not. Rabbi Eliezer says yes, and Rabbi Yeshua says no. So Gemara says, let's analyze this. What is this machlokes about? Why would one say yes and one say no? So Gemara says, first of all, we have to be talking about where she's an Eshes Kohen, where the man's a Kohen. If he was a Yisrael, then there couldn't be any possible way that anybody could say that he's obligated to redeem her. The statement of obligation of a Yisrael is that he has to redeem her and take her back as his wife. This guy can't take her back as his wife. There's an Isser Hana between them. So if she's a Yisrael, there's definitely nothing to talk about. So it's got to be talking about where she's a Kohen, where he's a Kohen. And then the Machlokes is the same as the Machlokes of Abaye and Rava. Abaye says that the obligation to redeem her still exists because a Kohen's statement of obligation is to take her back and give her and return her to her own city. Doesn't have to marry her. Rava says no. The only thing different about a Kohen is that we say that to bring her home city, that the fact that she was nenas doesn't make her usher. But if there's a different isser, then there is no statement that he has to redeem her. So that would seem to be that is the Machlokes Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer as well. So the Gemara says not necessarily. I'll tell you different shot in this Machlokes. The Gemara is going to try one possibility, then reject it, and then give another one and accept it. So the Gemara wants to say, first of all, the Machlokes over here is as follows. Everybody could agree to Abaye that in the case of a Isser Kahuna, if he was a Kohen, everybody could agree that there would be a Chiv. Everybody agreed to Rava that there wouldn't be a Chiv. Here is a totally different issue altogether. And that's because what actually happened here was that this neder was made by her. She made the Isser Hana neder, and he wasn't Mayfair. And the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is who's responsible for that. According to Rabbi Yeshua, we blame her for it. It's her fault. What did she go ahead and make this neder for? Therefore, she loses the right to redemption. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we say that he does have to redeem her because we blame him for it. Why was he not made for the neder? And therefore, he's definitely has the obligation to redeem her. She shouldn't lose just because he did something wrong and allowed this neder to stand. So that's what the machlokes is over. Was who's responsible for this creation? Who's responsible? Who do we blame for this neder here? So we have two problems with this shot. Problem number one is that if somebody held that she was responsible, then she wouldn't get a ksuba. How could it be that they both agree that she gets her ksuba? If she went and she made a neder which breaks up the marriage, and somebody's holding her responsible for it, then there's no ksuba. That's question number one. Question number two is that the brisa continues, and the brisa says that Rebbe says, I asked Sumchas, in the case here of the neder, does it make a difference if she was captured before the neder or after the neder? And Rebbe said that Sumchas told him, yes, it has to be that she was captured after the neder. The neder had to be pre-existing, because if you could just make a neder, and according to one opinion, you could get out of the obligation to redeem, so that nobody would ever redeem. Anytime his wife is captured, he would just say, I make a neder, Isser Hana between us, now I don't have to redeem her anymore. What kind of chiv would that be? Now, if it's true that the case of this brisa is, as you say, that she made the neder, so that kind of makes no sense. What do you mean everybody could get out of it? They can't get out of it. It only works if she made the neder. Obviously, we're talking about where he made the neder, and therefore this whole question of do we blame her, do we blame him when she makes a neder and he's not mefer is not correct. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you a different shot. And the different shot here is as follows. The question is, at what moment do we view the creation of this chiyuv? Is it at the time of the marriage or at the time of the captivity? When he marries her is when they sign the ksuba. At that moment, when he said, I'm going to redeem you and take you back as my wife, at that moment, she was still mutter to him. So at that moment, that is a true statement. If the obligation hits then the obligation stands. Or do we say, no, it takes place when she's actually captured. Now is when the obligation to redeem kicks in. At that moment, he's usher to her, because at that moment, they have an Isser Hana. Now the question is, if we look at this moment, we look at the end, then there's no longer possible, and he no longer has a chiyuv to redeem her. So that's the machlokes. Now, are we talking about a Kohen? Are we talking about mamzeres nesin? That will be a Abaye and Rava's machlokes. In a case where it's kol Yisrael, mamzeres nesin, everybody will agree that there's no chiyuv to redeem. If we're talking about an Ashes Kohen, and it's a Kohen Isser, a Manal Kohen Gadol, something like that, Abaye will say there is a chiyuv to redeem, Rava will say there isn't. But this is an irrelevant issue. This is a totally different subject. This is when you have an Isser Hana, and we're speaking about Yisrael here. When we have an Isser Hana, does that make a problem, or do we view that the chiyuv is created earlier at the time of the marriage, or later and there is an Isser Hana there. That's the issue. Okay, this concludes the Gemara's discussion. The Gemara now goes on to what happens if the husband dies. Is there an obligation on the inheritors, on the Yarshim, to redeem the father's wife? So the halacha, the Gemara says that we have two contradictory brises. Brisa number 1 says it depends on whether the chiyuv to redeem her existed before the father died or not. When does the chiyuv to redeem her start? It starts when the father finds out that she was captured and he knows about it, and now he's obligated to do something about it. If that happened while he was alive, then the obligation to redeem exists. It gets passed on to the sons and they have to redeem her. If that happened after he died, meaning the father never found out about it, then the obligation is never created and the sons can't inherit it. That's the first brisa, which the Gemara says Levi wanted to do that halacha l'maisa, and Rav told him that the halacha is not like that. It's like the other brisa that contradicts this. The other brisa says it's not true. And the only way that you can have a chiyuv to redeem is if there's a husband around, because the chiyuv stated in the Ksuba says, I will redeem her and take her back as my wife. If the husband's dead, that can't exist. The Yarshim don't have that phrase, I'll take her back as my wife. Therefore, the entire chiyuv to redeem does not exist on the children. That's the second brisa, which Rav says is halacha l'maisa. Now the Gemara goes on to how much does he have to pay. So Gemara brings a brisa that says he has to pay up to 10 times her value on the shefcha market. That's the first time she's redeemed. Anytime afterward, he doesn't have to pay anything. It's up to his to desire whether he wants to redeem her or not. The gzeira, the chiyuv on him in the ksuba is only to redeem her once. If it happens more than once, it's not an issue. Now, all this is the Gemara's first quote. The Gemara then says, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says that you don't have to pay more than the value. You don't have to pay 10 times the value, as the first brisa said, only up to the actual value. So Gemara asks, that means that to say that he does have to pay up to the value. We have a different phrase that says that he has to pay only up to the value of the ksuba, not more than the ksuba, because this is all part of the ksuba. So it's a contradiction. So Gemara says it's not a contradiction. Both limiting factors apply, up to her value or up to the ksuba, whichever is lower. It doesn't have to pay more than either of them. Now, what's the reason for this limitation? So the limit is because it's mipnei tikkun ha'olam. We don't want people to be incentivized to go around kidnapping women and holding them ransom. And therefore, we don't make them pay more than that. Also, his obligation is limited by the ksuba. It doesn't have a greater obligation than the ksuba itself. All right, now the Gemara moves on to the concept of the chiyuv refuah, that a husband has to pay medical bills for his wife, and after he dies, that is taken from his property to pay the medical and treatment of the almana. So the Gemara quotes a brisa that says, where does this money come from? So the Gemara says that the Tanna Kama says it counts as mizonos. Mizonos means the sustenance, the things she needs to live. Medical treatment is something she needs to live, and therefore it comes from the mizonos. Now, mizonos is something that the Yisomim have to pay from the estate, not limited to the ksuba, and it's not deducted from the ksuba. It's a separate obligation. The ksuba is one payment, and then separately the estate has to pay her food, her sustenance, and her medical bills. Now, the Gemara says, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel said it depends. It depends what type of medical treatment, and is divided to continuing with no limit, medical treatment that goes on, a chronic condition, that's considered to be like food, because that goes on, and that's not something that has a limit, just like food has no limit. If, however, you're talking about a one-time treatment, or a set time treatment, a set course of treatment, that's not food. That's a limited expense, and that comes from the ksuba, and that can be deducted from the ksuba. So the Gemara says it was an incident that happened in Rabbi Yochanan's family, that there were Yisomim who had to pay very continuous chronic medical bills for an almana, trying to figure out a way out of it. So they came to Rabbi Yochanan for advice. And Rabbi Yochanan advised them, go to the doctor and make a subscription plan with him. Say, look, we're going to subscribe to your services, we're going to pay you X amount of money, and you're going to treat her. And that's all included in this fixed amount. That way it becomes a fixed bill, and that way it comes from the ksuba, and it doesn't come from the mizonos. It's not something that they have to keep on paying from the estate of the inheritance. So Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan later regretted that he gave this advice. And Gemara asks, and he said about himself that I'm becoming like a lawyer here. So Gemara says, what did he think at first, and what did he regret? So Gemara says, at first he thought that mibsar chal tasalim, one has to take care of his family. These Yisomim were his family members, and therefore he wanted to take care of them. But later he realized that as an Adam Chashuv, he has to hold himself to a higher standard, and he cannot look out to his family members to that extent. We now begin the next Mishnah, which introduces three more Tanai Vezdin that apply to the Ksuba. Three more things which Chazal put into the Ksuba, whether it's written there or not, are obligations on the estate of the father. And those are as follows. Number one is what we've been discussing for the last few daf, what's called Kesubos Daf, and that is there are certain rights that a woman has in the marriage that go to her sons exclusively. They are not inherited by other sons of her husband from other women. They go directly to her own sons and are limited to them. What are those? It's anything that her husband puts into her and anything that her father puts into the marriage. So the ksuba that her husband owes her, if she dies before him, goes to her sons and is not divided up amongst his other sons, even though the husband al pi din inherits his wife. And the husband therefore should inherit that money and it should be split amongst the rest of his sons. The ksuba gives a condition that it's not divided amongst all the sons, only the sons of this woman. The other thing is not mentioned in our Mishnah, but it's brought in the Gemara as being the same halacha. That's if she gets a dowry from her father to bring into the marriage, that although al pi din, her husband inherits that when she dies, if she dies first, again, that only goes to her sons. It is not divided up amongst the other sons of her husband. Now, that's all tonight, based in number one. Number two is what we call Kesubos Nokvin, and that's the daughters that she has have to be supported from the father's estate as long as they are still single. Once they get married, it's their husband's responsibility to support them. And the third is dependent on a different minhagim. In Yerushalayim and in the Galil, they would write in the Ksuba, and it was part of the Tanai Bezdin of the Ksuba, that the Almana herself has to be supported from the estate of the husband as long as she is single, as long as she's an Almana and she's single and she is alive. Now, in Yehuda, that is slightly different minig. There, they said that the Yisomim have a choice. The Yarshim have a choice. They could either support her, or they could grant her ksuba and say, take this money, and this is how you're going to support yourself. And when it runs out, it's your problem. We're not supporting you forever. The Gemara now begins. If the Gemara wants to know what is the reason for the first Tanai Vezin, that of Kesubos B'din Edichin, why did they say that the sons get this property altogether? And it's not shared with brothers from a different mother. So the Gemara answers that it's really about the dowry that's given by the mother's father. And the reason is because we want to make sure that men will give their daughters a dowry. We want them to give them the money and the property so that they'll be attractive to marry. And fathers would be hesitant to give that if they knew that it would have to be shared with their daughter's sons and other sons from other women to her husband, that they wouldn't want to give so much because that money is leaving the family. So therefore, in order to make sure that people wouldn't skimp on the dowry so that women would be able to get married, they made sure that it would be limited, it would stay in the family. The dowry that he gives his daughter would stay by his daughter's sons afterwards. So the Gemara says, if that's a pshat, then it's a gzeira d'Rabbanan, which uproots a halacha d'oraisa. The oraisa of the halacha is that inheritance goes to a man. He inherits his wife, and then they go to his sons from him. They don't go to the daughters if there are sons. How do we have the right to say that it is shared and it's given only to these sons and not to other sons? So the Gemara says that the answer is that there's a remiss to this in the Torah itself. The Gemara quotes from Navi, the Gemara quotes from Yirmiyahu, where it says, "Chu noshem v'yilidu ubanim ubanos, u'chu livnechem noshem v'es benosechem tenu la'anoshim," which pretty much says, marry off your sons and your daughters, find wives and husbands for them. So the Gemara says, I understand how you find a wife for your son. Men, they could find a wife for themselves, they could find a wife for their sons. They're in that sugya. But how are they supposed to find husbands for the daughters? How do they do that? They don't know anything about finding husbands. So Gemara answers, obviously what it means is they should make their daughters attractive to marry by giving them property. And therefore we need to have this be set up that the men will take care of the daughters and make sure that they become desirous of marriage. And that's what it's referring to over here. Now, the Gemara asks, how much does he have to give her as a Nadunya? How much should this dowry be? So Abaye and Rava both say 1/10 of his property. Now the Gemara has a series of fast-hitting questions. If this is the reason for this Kesubos Benin Zichrin, then it should be different in a number of ways. The Gemara asks, first of all, then it should only come from the father's estate. It should only be that the inheritance of their mother's father goes to them. What does it have to do with the inheritance of her husband, meaning the ksuba that she gets from her husband? What does that have to do with anything? We're discussing what she gets from her father. The whole purpose for it was that her father should give her money as a dowry, and that he shouldn't be afraid to lose it. What does it have to do with her husband giving her the ksuba? So the Gemara says, if the husband wasn't giving her things that would stay in the family, the father wouldn't want to either. The father would feel like that's not fair. The husband pulls his weight and he does his part, so then the father will as well. Therefore, in order to make sure that the father gives the dowry, they have to make sure that the husband gives the ksuba and that stays in the family and it does not leave. So the Gemara says, if that's true, so then you should only make the husband's ksuba stay in the son's family, stay by the sons and not go to other sons, only if the father really gave the dowry. What if about a case of the father didn't give a dowry? It was a stingy father anyway. So there's no reason that the husband's property should stay. That wasn't necessary. The husband's ksuba therefore should be divided equally amongst his other sons. The Gemara says, no, you can't make splits in the Takanas Chachamim, Lei Plug. They made the same rules for everyone. So the Gemara says, well, if this is true, if this is the reason, so then the daughter should inherit from sons as well. Meaning to say, what if this wife doesn't have sons? What if she only has a daughter? And there are sons from a different marriage. The way we set this up, the daughter's not going to get anything. It's going to go to the other sons. So how does that help? The father wants it to stay in his family. It should go to his daughters, to his granddaughters as well. Why does that only go if he has grandsons? Somewhere says because the Chazal set it up as a type of Yerusha. They gave it the rules of an inheritance. They said that the sons inherit their mother's property here, their mother's property from her father and from her husband. Therefore, it has to follow the rules of inheritance. A daughter is not going to get if there are sons, as is the rule with all inheritance. So the Gemara says, well, okay, but then what if there are only daughters? What if there are daughters to this wife and daughters to others? Then they should have a separate right to collect their brother's ksuba and her dowry over the other daughters. But that's not halacha. You don't say ksuba has been in nokvin there. You divide it up evenly amongst all the daughters. Why is that different? The Gemara says because it's a lay plug. You have to make a general rule. This is something that went to the sons and not to the daughters like all inheritance. Now the Gemara asks, if it's made like an inheritance, it should be collected from metaltalin. Why is this ksubas b'nin addition only collected from real estate? So the Gemara answers, because it is a type of ksuba, it's a tanai ksuba, it has to follow the rules of ksuba. And ksuba can only be collected from real estate, not from metaltalin. So the Gemara says, well, if it's a ksuba, so then they should be able to take from nechasim mishubadim, from property that was sold, like every ksuba can. So the Gemara says, no, because it is also an inheritance. An inheritance one does not inherit property that the father sold, only property that the father still owns at the time that he died. So in a sense, it is like a ksuba, that it's only real estate, and it is like an inheritance, that it is only property that's owned now, and not property that was sold. So now then we're asked, so what's the reason for the halacha of Meiser Dinar, that this halacha only applies if there is at least a dinar's worth of inheritance left over for the other sons? It can't be that the entire estate is this value. It all goes to the sons of this wife. So Gemara says, what's the reason for that? And what's the reason for that is that otherwise you'll totally uproot the din deraisa of inheritance here. And Chazal never made a takana that totally takes away the entire din deraisa altogether. Now the Gemara quotes a story. The Gemara says that Rav Papa did a shidduch with Abba Surah, and he went to travel to Abba Surah's house in order to write the ksuba. Now Yehuda Bar Maremer heard that he was coming and he wanted to visit with him, so he went and he walked with him. When they got to the doorway to go into Abba Surah's house, he didn't want to go inside, so he asked permission from Rav Papa to leave. So he said, well, no, come in with me. So he didn't want to. He saw that he didn't want to, so he said, what are you afraid of? So maybe you're afraid because Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, don't be in a place where you're transferring inheritance from one to another, even from a bad son to a good son. You shouldn't be involved there because maybe bad things are going to come out of this. You can end up transferring inheritance to the wrong person. And here we're writing a ksuba, and we're going to be writing ksubas b'nei nedichon, which means we're taking inheritance away from the sons and giving it to other sons, giving it to the sons of this particular wife. Maybe that's what you're concerned about, but you don't have to. there's not a concern because this is a takanas chachamim, so there's no concern. So he went in with him, and what ended up happening was that he was quiet. He didn't say anything, and Abasura saw that he was quiet, and based on that, he gave a larger ksuba. He ended up writing all his property over as a ksuba, and he was still quiet because it's not the reason he was quiet. So Abasura said to him, "What do you want me to do? How much can I give?" So he said, "I didn't want you to give even this much. This is not. I didn't take pleasure from this. I wasn't trying to express displeasure with what you were doing." So he said, "So let me undo what I did. Let me take it back." So he said, "No, once you promised it, it cannot be redone or taken back."